Do you all know why you're here? To hear some badass stories? Yeah. Excellent. And it's a good way, I think, to prep for Women's Day, too, is to know that we're part of this long line of people. These people who have fought for what they loved, for what they cared about, just fought for their right to create space. And for me, that has become a really important realization recently. So there's this line by Padraig O'Tuama. Exile might feel like home, but it's always going to feel like exile too. And so he is an Irish queer poet, and he's talking about his lived experience. But I have to say, when I first heard that, it was like a punch in the guts. I love this city. I've become so obsessed with this city that I've made it my mission to tell these badass stories of women and Amsterdammers of color and queer Amsterdammers throughout history. And yet I'm telling them in English, because when I try to speak Dutch, all my brain can do is grammar. I'm not actually paying attention to what I'm saying because I'm thinking about die and dat and where all is an of and where does the verb go in this sentence. And that can be hard. But so I'm working on these stories of 17th century women for something I'm going to do in June. And as I've been working on these stories, they've actually kind of captured me and reframed what I'm experiencing. So maybe what I'm experiencing now isn't exile. Maybe what I'm experiencing is just another step on this very long journey. Basically, they're reframing how I got here. And how I got here starts in New York. So New York, if you haven't been there, it is a city of mad energy. There's 10 million people in the city. There's 30 million people in the tri-state area, which means like the people who can commute in. And there's so much happening. And I moved at 22 with nothing. I didn't know anyone there. I had $1,000, which even then, that's like maybe 1 month's rent. I had a sublet in Spanish Harlem, which at the time, Spanish Harlem was so Spanish that not only was I the only non-Latin woman in my entire neighborhood, on the 4 avenues between me and the subway, I was the only person who wasn't Dominican. Luckily, I speak Spanish, so I started chatting with the lady at the laundromat, and she started trying to set me up with her son. But I started to, feel like maybe I was okay in this neighborhood. And I was there to do theater. That was all I had wanted ever since I was a little girl, was to direct plays. When I was like 8, I decided I was going to direct. Can't tell you what was going on there. And I got an internship to this big theater. So it felt like I move here and then I get this internship and now things are happening. It was very exciting. And my boss at this internship, he was the assistant to this very important director. So, 1 level removed from power, but still. And he was a few years older than me. And I honestly feel a little guilty telling you this story because I do think he was a good guy. I do think he was someone who meant well. But I made him a little bit crazy. He had to explain rules of the office to me. Like he had to sit me down and be like, okay, your lunch break is an hour. So it's okay if you go to the gym on your lunch break, but it's an hour from when you leave your desk to when you come back to your desk. It's not an hour from when you get to the gym and when you leave the gym. Stuff like that. And then one day we were talking and he asked me how many men I'd slept with. And I got really flustered and I lied. And it was this really interesting moment because he and I both knew I was lying. I saw it on his face. And I have to tell you, for the longest time, I remembered that story as something embarrassing I did, as this is a story where I did something wrong. It really wasn't until I was prepping this story to tell you all that I realized how inappropriate that was for my boss to ask me how many men I'd slept with. And that wasn't the only time something like that happened. There was a big push for us interns of like, you want to get a mentor. You want to find a producer who will mentor you. This was like the way that you move up in the theater world. And so I was really excited when this producer who I'd met through this theater, he had free tickets to some musical, some revival of like Carousel or Oklahoma or something that's been revived 10,000 times. And I was like, great, I'm gonna go, I'm gonna see the show with this guy, he's gonna become my mentor, and then I'm gonna direct when I'm like 22 on Broadway, it's gonna be great. And we're in the middle of dinner, and I realize he thinks it's a date. This guy is significantly older than my father, and there was nothing in our interaction to even make me suspect. And so I had to figure out my way to get back to the subway without this guy making a pass at me. And then I had to deal with being in the office with this guy who thinks we went on a date. And I have to say, for a long time, I've thought about stuff like this, and I've thought about that girl who moved to New York at 22. I didn't have a lot of compassion for her. I've thought about this as like mistakes that I made. And then there's this story that I've been working on, and I kind of reframed it. See, these stories that I'm about to tell you, they're totally different, right? Like we're talking about the 1600s is a totally different world. So I don't want you to draw direct comparisons to my experience, to your experience. But what's interesting is history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Sometimes by hearing these stories so different than ours, it can maybe do a little bit of twisting of our own experience. So let me tell you about this one. There's this really interesting incident that got preserved by accident. So many of the cool stories of Amsterdam were preserved by accident. And this one is in a notary's office. In 1656, a sugar trader named Burgos, who'd come from Brazil, went to a notary to have his complaint legally written down. He wanted the city government to know that there was a problem. And his problem was that his slave had run away. He was very specific. I bought her as a child in Brazil, and I've kept her with me ever since then, and I was going to sell her in Brazil, but she wanted to come to the Dutch Republic, so I brought her with me, and now that I'm going to Barbados, she has the nerve to run away. This was a 24-year-old woman named Juliana. And obviously this isn't her, but there was a free Black community living here in Amsterdam, so you do get etches and drawings, and even Rembrandt did a full painting of Black people in this area. So this isn't her, but this is someone who really existed. So anyway, Juliana gets here, and she finds out about Amsterdam law, which is there was this law passed in 1644 that slavery is illegal in Amsterdam. But it's kind of a chicken law. So slavery is illegal. So if you bring an enslaved person here, they're free, but they have to know about the law, they have to go to the city government, they have to be able to file paperwork, including confronting the slave owner, and they have to prove that they have somewhere where they're gonna go. So a lot of slave owners, including this Burgos guy, bring enslaved people anyway. And Juliana finds out about this, and Juliana just walks out of the house. And the complaint that Burgos leaves is that she doesn't actually want to be free. She's been riled up by this free Black community in the Jewish neighborhood. See, at this point, there's about 100 people living in the Jewish neighborhood. A lot of them are working as sailors or servants, but they're not enslaved. It's a free Black community, and there's a lot of evidence of them being a close-knit community. And basically what Burgos is accusing them of is he says that they're going to find enslaved people and to rile them up against slavery and to get them to file these papers. And for the longest time as I've told this story, that's what I focused on. Because it's such an amazing image, right? The idea that these people are like, there's only 100 people in Amsterdam at this point is, getting close to 100,000. Like, there's a lot of people in Amsterdam. But it's such an interesting idea of them walking the canals to see if they can see someone who's enslaved, to see if they can let them know, hey, you're free. Here's how you get free. And so for the longest time, as I was telling that story, that's what I focused on. This beautiful idea of this community. And it was only recently that I thought about Juliana's experience. She was 24 years old. And Burgos said he bought her as a girl, which means this is someone who has likely been enslaved her entire life. All she knows is slavery. And she has the courage to just walk into this crazy, bustling, incredibly crowded metropolis that is Amsterdam at this point. She has the courage to walk into that, and to make herself a new life. I can't imagine where that courage came from, but I find it so inspiring and so impressive. I wish I could have used some of it. Back in New York, things were going okay. Like, the internship ended, and I didn't become the youngest director ever on Broadway, but I started getting these indie gigs. It's kind of hard for me to explain to you guys because there's so much funding for the arts here compared to in the US, that these indie shows are quite small. And even though they're quite small, they're quite expensive. So it's a challenge. It's one of the problems that you have as a director, is you have to build your reputation, and your access to these shows is quite low. So I was happy that I was getting these indie shows, and things are going kind of okay, but I can't seem to get to the next level. There's these fellowships and grants and programs that are designed to take the really talented indie directors and move them up to the next level. And it's not just me. I know these really amazing female directors, some of whom, I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little bit jealous of. There was this one woman, Nicole, who's just so smart and so good at working with actors that I really liked her, and I would be friends with her, but I'd also have to really push down on that little burning knot of envy when I saw her work. But Nicole was running into the same thing that I was. We just weren't getting those fellowships. We just weren't getting those grants. And Nicole and I were both up. It's okay, come on and sit down. Nicole and I were both up for this big grant that really could have brought us to the next level. And while we were in the waiting room, I ran into this young guy. So he, at this point, I'm 30, I think. And Nicole's probably about the same age. And this is a 22-year-old kid who I know because we've both worked for the same theater. And I'm chatting with him in between our first interview and our second interview. And I was in this panel of largely female directors who grilled me like I was a New York steak. I could barely get one answer out before they were. There was a guy on the panel who would kind of interrupt and moderate a little bit, but this was a really challenging interview. So I'm sitting, trying to prepare, okay, there was that interview. All right, let me lift myself up for the next interview. And the kid that I know starts chatting with me, and he says, yeah, they were really nice, but I realized while I was interviewing with them that maybe 2 weeks isn't long enough to rehearse a classical show. For reference, a classical show should be at least 4 weeks, if not longer. And that kid ended up getting the fellowship, and Nicole and I didn't. And a little bit later, there's this great playwright named Lisa Cron, who had been doing all of this amazing work for decades, and then I think she must have been late 50s, if not 60s, she finally gets a Tony. And she uses her Tony speech to say, as long as the theater judges women by their experience and men by their potential, we will never have equal representation. And I thought back on that Drama League moment, and I saw what had happened to me and Nicole. I saw the way even women were perpetuating this inequity. And I didn't know what else to do. I just kept trying. How do you deal with this? How do you change a system from inside when you don't have any power? I got lucky. I got a fellowship. It took me out of the city, so I was in DC for four months. And it was supposed to be really great because I was like, not assistant director, but like the peon to the assistant director for this big theater. And the director didn't really talk to me, and he didn't really talk to his assistant. And there were men running every single department and women who were assistants in every single department, and that pattern kind of played out across the departments. But I got lucky. Part of this fellowship was I was allowed to research at the Folger Library, which is this massive, I don't know if you guys have been to Etz Haim in the Portuguese synagogue, or that beautiful library in the Rijksmuseum where you can go in and just get a look at some of the art, or maybe the Staatsarchief. Like, it's one of those type of beautiful environments. And then I got access to these really, really old texts. And it saved me. I spent this fellowship not improving my directing career, but learning how to research and finding all these amazing, amazing women in history. And so that's what I did in DC. And I didn't know about her yet, but there was a woman that I think would have really helped me at this moment. I don't know if you've heard this name. She's, at the very least, the first woman in the Netherlands to study at a university. Some of the sources I read say the first woman in Europe. Haven't been able to verify that. But she was kind of a natural genius. Like, by the time she was 3, she was already writing. By the time she was 6, she was already painting. And she was just, I don't know if you've ever seen these kids, they're pretty rare, but she was just one of those kids that, like, everything you give her, she soaks in. So her father started teaching her languages. Her father was big on education. He was making sure that her brothers got educated. And when he saw how much his daughter was taking in, he was like, okay, sure, let's give Anna some education as well. And this woman ended up learning so many languages. She had German, she had French, she had English, she had Hebrew, she had Latin, she had Greek. I'm losing so many of them. She had Syrian, she had Ethiopian. Like, she just was a sponge for languages. And so she used that to start writing. By the time she was a teenager, she was in touch with all of these huge intellectual powers. As you might know, the 1600s was a time where there was a lot of stuff happening in Dutch intellectual life. Some of the people we talk about today, some of the people that the statues are made for and that the streets are named after, some of the people whose intellectual prowess is still being taught in universities today, these are the people she was hanging out with. She was writing to them, she was seeing them. And as she started kind of sending these letters back and forth, she started to feel really passionately that women need to be educated. She was very devout, so she was coming at it from a point of view of, we need to be able to read the Bible. Women need to have access to education so that we can read the scriptures for ourselves, so that we can read the scriptures in their original language, and so we can have the rich spiritual life that we deserve. And that was kind of the foundation for her argument for women's education. She said, we need to be able to be better Christians. But she kept pushing, and she kept pushing. Just push, push, push. And finally, in 1636, with the professor sponsoring her, she was allowed to attend classes at Utrecht University. But so that she wouldn't distract from anyone, she was of course not officially enrolled. And to be sure that she wouldn't distract anyone, they made her sit behind a curtain so that no one could see her. Yeah. She wrote a poem to Utrecht University nonetheless. And she published a lot, but one of her big manifestos was 5 years later, where she wrote this massive manifesto about education, why it was important and why women should have access to it. And even though she was kind of like held up as this great intellectual light, people were like, oh yeah, of course she would think that, but really, we can't be educating women. And what's so interesting about her is that after she died, she wasn't remembered as an intellectual. She was remembered as a painter. Which, like, yeah, this is a self-portrait. Like, she drew and she painted. But That's like remembering Van Gogh as a pastor in the coal mines. Like, that's not the thing that she made an impact with. It really, for centuries, it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that she started to be rediscovered as a scholar, instead of being thought of as like, oh yeah, we had some cool female painters, like Raquel Rausch and Judith Leister, and like, oh yeah, there's her. But I agree with a lot of her sentiment. Not about, I don't use my education to read the Bible, but the way that the more we learn, the more stories we have access to, the more it helps us shape our spiritual lives. And that's what that research really did for me. So I'm back in New York, back from DC. And I took all that research from the Folger Library and I made a play about women in power. I used some of the stuff from the Folger, I used some Shakespeare pieces to talk about the women of the War of the Roses and the women of the 100 Years' War and how there wasn't really an acceptable role for women. It didn't really matter if you were Joan of Arc or if you were Margaret, who took on a very masculine leadership, or if you were someone like Elizabeth of York, who tried to use her feminine wiles to manipulate the men around her. What the play explored is the way that fell short for all of them. And this is in 2014, 2015. This is when Hillary Clinton is starting her first campaign for presidency in the US, so this is a relevant question. How do we feel about women in power? And I had this amazing reading. I was really lucky. I got some really high-profile actors. I used every connection I had ever made in the entire time I've been in New York to lean on their friends to get a bunch of industry people to this reading. And the response was overwhelming. People were so positive. I had, like, you know what yeah bullshit is, and you know when someone's being genuine with you. I had some really genuine responses. And I left that reading thinking, yes, this is it. I finally have my piece. I finally have my thing that's gonna break me through. And then nothing happened. So I started working really hard to sell this play, because as Donald Trump entered the election, this felt even more important that we talk about how we feel about women in power. And I had other stuff that I was working on. So I was trying to sell this play, and there was 2 other plays that I was trying to sell. And I had these meetings back to back that kind of let me know what I was up against. So one of the plays I was trying to sell was this play that used Asian history to talk about the roles of Asian American women and what Asian American women experience in American culture. And so, like, this is recognizable to any woman, right? Like, any woman understands having these narrow roles projected onto her. So I went to the Women's Theater. If anyone would understand this play, it would be the Women's Theater. And the Women's Theater said, yeah, I don't think our audience would get this, but, there's 2 Asian theaters. Why don't you go to the Asian theaters? And both of the Asian theaters said, yeah, including the female artistic director of one of them, said, yeah, this isn't really for our audience. You should go to the Women's Theater. Because the Asian theaters thought, well, we want to talk to men. And the Women's Theater thought, well, most of our audience is white, so they won't get this. And so that was disheartening, as you can imagine. And then only a couple weeks later, I had these 2 meetings a day apart. And the first meeting was with a producer, a commercial producer, and I was selling this musical about the Harlem Renaissance, which, if you haven't heard of it, the Harlem Renaissance was this huge cultural blossoming in the 1920s, and it was mostly Black artists and Black intellectuals. It's a huge moment in Black American culture. And so I sit down with this producer, and he stops me, he's heard some of the songs. He's like, yeah, the music is good, and yeah, you've got a great pitch, but no one's gonna buy this. Black audiences never show up to the theater, assuming that only a Black audience would want to see a musical that had Black people in it. And so that was frustrating. But then the very next day, I went to the classical theater to talk about that play I just told you about, the one that had the women in power. And at this point, it's deep into 2015, maybe even the beginning of 2016. So this is becoming really urgent feeling because there's a lot flying around in our culture about women in power, and I just don't like her, and I just don't trust her, and all of that incoherent things that are happening. And I sit down with the director of the classical theater, and he stops me. He's like, yeah, no, it sounds really interesting, but 70% of our tickets are bought by women. We don't need to appeal to women. We already have women. We need things that'll appeal to men. And it was right after the Harlem thing, where they were like, Black audiences don't show up. So it really felt like, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And I just felt stuck. I felt like I was working in this system that was completely tilted. Which is actually brings me to the story that kind of prompted this whole exploration of the 17th century. Have you guys seen this painting? Has anyone seen this painting? It hangs in the Rijksmuseum. It used to be called, let me get out of the way so you guys can see it. This painting used to be called Peter Knoll and Family. They've recently updated it to say Peter Knoll, Cornelia Nyenrode, and Family. I'm not going to go into this part, but actually one of the people who's enslaved behind her led a rebellion against the Dutch that kept them out of Java for decades. So they need to do a little bit more adjusting to the title. But Cornelia's story is fascinating. So she was born in Japan. There was a couple bases. You may know that Japan's government, when Europeans showed up, were like, no, this is a bad idea. So they limited, mostly the Dutch, to like specific islands. Like you can be here, and you can be here, and that's it. You can't come anywhere else in the country. And so Cornelia was born on one of those islands. Her father was the chief of the VOC, like chief of the trading post, and her mother was a concubine. And when her father died, she was only a little girl, but she was taken from her mother because her father had left an inheritance, and in his will he said that he wanted his daughters, she was not the only daughter of a concubine, he wanted his daughters to have a Christian upbringing. So even though these girls had living mothers, they were taken from their mothers and taken to Batavia. This is modern-day Jakarta in Indonesia, across an ocean. And they were raised in an orphanage. I know, I can only imagine both her as a little girl and what it was like for her mother. When Cornelia turned 21, she married an up-and-coming accountant named Peter Knoll. And Peter continued to rise. And honestly, their relationship looks quite happy. They had 10 children. Yeah, they had lots of children. Unfortunately, only their son survived to adulthood. Yeah, so they had some happiness and they had some darkness too. But for about 20 years, they had this vibrant household. And then when she was 41, her husband died. Now you may know, I don't think Cornelia did, under Dutch law at this point, as a widow, she now gets to control this massive fortune that's been left to her, both by her father and by her late husband. She was having some problems. The merchants were jerking her around, the VOC council was jerking her around. They all kind of felt like, okay, like maybe technically you have the right to this inheritance, but what are you gonna do? Who are you gonna complain to if we don't give it to you? So this guy came who was part of the ruling council, and he offered her marriage. And she was like, yeah, this is a good idea, right? I'll marry this guy in the ruling council, he'll be sure I get my inheritance. At this point, her kids are alive, or some of her kids are alive, so like she's trying to secure it to pass on to her children. And this guy turns out to be the biggest monster in human clothing that you can imagine. He immediately takes all of her property and all of her possessions. He beats her publicly. She refuses to live with them, But the VOC won't let them divorce. She's like a fox with her hand in the trap. She cannot get away. Finally, she raises, and she fights so hard. Like, this woman fought and fought and fought, and she raised such a ruckus that finally the VOC was like, get out. They weren't willing to let them divorce, but they sent the couple to the Netherlands. Of course, they went on separate ships. Cornelia's story ends quite sadly. Here in the Netherlands, a judgment was passed that they couldn't get divorced, but that her husband had the right to her property. She was fighting it, and then she disappears. She didn't show up for the next hearing to fight this judgment. It's likely she passed away because she never shows up again. It's a really difficult story, right? Someone who again and again and again was betrayed by this system. She should be someone who had every luxury, born to a wealthy father, married a wealthy man, heir to a wealthy man. But again and again and again, she tripped over her powerlessness within this system. It's a hard thing to experience. And again, like, I'm talking about stories that rhyme. I don't want to compare my experience to theirs, but I think it's easier sometimes to recognize things in the distant past and to pull things out that might apply to our modern day. As you may know, 2015 and 2016 were really ugly years in the US. I know we've had a lot of them, but those were pretty bad years in the public discourse. And one of the things that made them so bad was there were all these assumptions about who queer people are, who Black Americans are, who Latino and Asian Americans are. I mean, I'm sure you guys have heard this, but literally, we had a presidential candidate who said that every single Mexican man is a rapist. And I wanted it to start, among other things, some sort of reflection and entertainment, because those ideas weren't appearing out of nowhere. There was so much stereotyping in American movies and American TV, and yes, in American theater. You tended to only see Black men as physically threatening. You didn't see a lot of like nerdy roles for Black men. You tended to only see a certain type of queer person. Like when I was growing up, you never saw queer people in the media. And so like, in some ways it was a step forward, but even 2015 and 2016, most of the queer people you saw were white. Most of the women were really butch, most of the men were really effeminate. And so I started working with these groups that were just advocating a change in representation, a change in how film and TV, because we were part of the industry. It was a lot of actors that I was working with, but I was working with Black actors and Asian actors to really advocate for changing how the industry treated them, because we were seeing played out on a national scale how important representation is. As I was doing this, as you can imagine, I was running into these kind of systemic problems, the same sort of thing that had happened. I was still trying to get that darn show produced. And, you know, at one point I had bragged to a friend of mine. She said she was really proud of me. And I said, I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna break the glass ceiling with my head. I don't care how many times I have to run into it. It will break before I do. Which was a little bit optimistic, shall we say. I can remember this moment really clearly when I knew I was done. We were taking a road trip through California, and I had been throwing all of my energy into doing a workshop, which is a sort of like staged reading, so it's not like a full production, but it's actually on its feet, because I was like, okay, well, maybe if these people who don't want to do the show because they don't need to attract women ticket buyers, maybe if they see it on his feet, they'll be like, oh no, we do need to do this. Again, it's put this in the same box as the comment about the glass ceiling. But I was supposed to be on vacation. The workshop was still like a month out maybe. And we were in the middle of nowhere, California. We stopped somewhere, and this gas station must have like a radio antenna or something because I get Wi-Fi for the first time all day. And up on my screen pops a problem with the workshop that I have to fix right away. So my friends and my partner who I'm on the road trip with, they're like going inside to this little fair, they're playing around, they're having a great time, and I'm pacing up and down this 2-lane highway in California, frantically calling actors to try and solve this problem. And I hang up the phone, and I look at my partner and my friends, and this voice whispers, I can't do this anymore. And then it said it much louder in case I was tempted to ignore it. The voice was like, no, really, I can't do this anymore. This is unthinkable. This is all I wanted to do since I was a little girl. I can't quit. Who would I be if I quit? So I just couldn't stuff it down. We're not going to talk about this. But what I didn't realize is I was actually at a fork in the road. And there are 2 sisters who you might have heard of actually. They certainly have streets named after them. There are 2 sisters who kind of exemplify that fork. You guys seen this painting? I'm going to stand out of the way again. This is a painting of the Mouter Crane. This is like the artists and intellectuals of 17th century Amsterdam. They apparently would hang out at this castle in Mouden, the Motorslot Castle. To be honest, there's a little bit of myth happening here. But this is Anna, and this is Maria. And the thing about Anna and Maria is they're the Williams sisters. Venus Williams is a great tennis player. If she lived at any other time in history, she might even be the best. But she just happened to have her career at the same time as the greatest female tennis player to ever live. And it was her sister. It's kind of what happened with Anna. Their father was at the center, their father was a minor poet, and he was at the center of this artistic and intellectual movement. And he just made his house like the club hangout. Like people were always going to their place on the Gelderskade. And so the girls grew up with this. And by the time Anna was a teenager, she was working her way into this poetry circle. She was the only woman. It was all these male poets. And then here's this girl who's quite a decent poet. And you know, they didn't say that she was the best, but they were like, yeah, Anna's pretty good. She was actually in touch with Anna Maria von Scherman, the scholar we talked about earlier, put in touch through this circle. And then her 10 years younger sister comes of age. And Maria Tesselschade, she lit up every room she walked into. I don't even know if this painting does her justice, even though literally everyone's looking at her. The artistic composition is like, let's all look at this chick. But the way people write about her, and the way they talk about her, it's not just that they call her brilliant, although they do. They write poems about her wit and her intellect and her beauty. But the underlying idea behind how they write about her, it really makes her sound like she takes all the gravity and pulls it towards her. You can imagine that can get wearing from your sister. But they stayed in this circle for decades. And then when Anna was 39 and Maria was 29, their father passed away. You may know that's quite an old age to not be married in the 1600s. They had both refused several times. They both refused marriage proposals. But when their father died, something changed. And I can't tell you what it was. I have no idea what it was. But first Anna, then Maria left Amsterdam, and they got married. They both converted to Catholicism when they were very Protestant before. And then they both had the choice of, what do I do next? And Maria, even though she was in Alkmaar, which I know it's close today, was not that close back then. She basically stayed with this circle. She spent all of her time writing letters back and forth. When her husband died, she started visiting back and forth the various people in this circle. The people that she started hanging out with as a teenager, she never left them. She kept, from a distance, kept writing and kept circling these relationships. And Anna did the exact opposite. Anna had already been translating, like she spoke a couple languages, she spoke German, she spoke French, and so she'd already been translating. But when Anna left, she started reaching out to other female writers. She would translate French writing into Dutch, she'd translate Dutch writing into French, she'd do a little bit of German, but to be honest, this was mostly a Dutch-French connection. And so instead, she became this nexus of these female writers, where before it was her and Maria, these kind of two female oddities in this group of men. She became part of this international web of female writers. And so I kind of think of them as the two examples of, like, when you quit something, especially something that's been formative, when you leave somewhere or someone or some group that has been part of shaping you, I think you have to do what Anna did. I think you have to cut it off entirely. I don't know that Maria's constantly going back was the right choice. And it was the choice I faced. Leaving New York would have been unthinkable, even a couple years earlier. But once I was done with theater, I started to really see how rough life was in New York. It took an hour to get between anywhere. When my partner and I first met, we both lived in Queens, the same borough, and it took an hour and a half to get between our apartments. It was really expensive, and as you may know, salaries haven't gone up in the US for 15 years maybe, so the rent was going up, but the salaries weren't. And people were just really angry. You could see it on the street. And it wasn't just, we don't have a mental health system, so anyone who's mentally ill tends to live on the street and tends to act out in ways that feel unsafe on the street or on the train. But it wasn't just that. We were all working so hard, working so many hours just to stay in these tiny little shoebox apartments and try to pursue whatever it was that brought us to New York. I guess I just felt ready to leave. And my partner figured out how to move to Amsterdam, the city that I had never particularly liked. Sorry. To be fair, my partner had wanted to move to Amsterdam for a while, so Amsterdam was like a little bit of the other woman in our relationship for a little bit. But my partner figured out a way to move here, and I spent the next 3 months packing up the apartment, for some reason, scanning every medical bill or phone bill that I'd ever had. Like, I have no idea why that was a high priority, is that I had to make sure I still had my phone bills from when I was 22. And saying goodbye to people. I've been in New York for 15 years. There was a lot of people to say goodbye to. There were so many books to give away. So I didn't really think about what I was going to do when I got here. There was one more story that I needed to learn. If you've seen this name before, it might be on the side of the artist. She was both a painter and someone who studied insects. So Linnaeus, when he was doing his classification of insects, he actually based that classification on her work. Now, I'm sorry, she's going to be an Amsterdammer, but like me, she was born somewhere else. She was raised in Germany. Both her father and her stepfather were painters. So she spent all of her young life learning how to paint, and she loved it. And then she married an artist, and it was great. And her husband was like, no. Your job is to run my studio. Your job is not to paint yourself. And so she did. She stopped painting. She raised their daughters. And as soon as those daughters were old enough to fend for themselves, she said, "I'm leaving. Do you want to come?" And they did. She showed up in Amsterdam, running away from her husband with her 2 adult daughters, and finally, she was going to set up an artist studio. So she set up a studio on the Kerkstraat, and she's got these beautiful prints that she's making. And it's like, it's going pretty well, you know? Like she's not like printing money or anything, but like things are going well. And then she hears about Suriname, this Dutch colony with this massive jungle. And remember, I told you she loves insects. She's loved insects for her whole life at this point. And so she's 50. And now I want you to remember, 50 in the 1600s, 50 in the 1600s is like 75 today, maybe? Like bad nutrition, no medical care. Like just think of her as way, way older than 50. And remember, they don't like women on boats, especially boats going to the colonies. Women are bad luck. Somehow, she talks her way, not just her, but she talks her and her daughter onto this ship to Suriname. She gets to Suriname, she disappears into the jungle for 18 months, and she comes back with this beautiful book of prints. You've probably seen them. They're so stunning. They get posted everywhere. And there's 2 ways to look at this book. So this book was 10 guilders, which is like way beyond what a craftsperson would make in like a month or 2. So anyone who buys this book, they probably are getting some money somewhere from the slave trade. And this book is just about plants and insects, right? Nothing about Suriname, nothing about the colony or blah, blah, blah. It's literally just plants and insects. Oh, by the way, this plant will end a pregnancy. And enslaved women will use this to end the pregnancy rather than give birth into slavery. So great is their horror of this institution. And so one way to look at this book is this is actually rather brave. That she's selling this book to slave owners or people making money from the slave trade. And she's put this little bomb in there, if they read it, of like, hey, by the way, you're making money from a horror. And I told the story like that for a while. And then I saw an exhibit by one of my favorite Dutch artists, Patricia Carson-Hout, who does a lot with Black history and a lot with history in general. And she had this series of prints of Maria Schiavone-Marion's work with these after images or ghost images of enslaved women and Native women. Because her point is that Maria Schiavone-Marion didn't discover any of this stuff about the plants or the insects. She was relying on indigenous women, and she was relying on enslaved women for their knowledge, and she didn't credit them. So I think both of those things, I try to hold both things as true. But the thing that I find most impressive about her is that she just started over. With everything that we've talked about from the 1600s, this is such a difficult time for women. They are so at the mercy of the laws and at the legal standing of men and their own legal standing. I mean, she was technically married, and she just said, no, this isn't the life I want. This is not how I'm going to live. I'm starting over. As did I. So we did move to Amsterdam, and when we moved here, this city that I had kind of been a little jealous of because my partner really wanted to move here and I wanted to stay in New York, suddenly this city became a paradise. And all these things that had happened along the way in New York laid the groundwork for where I am now. I started researching women. The thing that I had started at the Folger, I continue to this day. I never thought I'd be a performer. I had to take performance classes in order to be a director, but I never thought I'd be a performer. But I just got so invested in sharing these stories about women and about Amsterdammers of color and about queer Amsterdammers throughout history. And part of the reason I got so invested was because of my experience with representation back in New York. So thinking about these stories, these 5 women that we talked about tonight, has kind of taken the bite out of that quote that exile might feel like home, but it will always feel like exile too. Because I've stopped thinking of Amsterdam as exile. I've started thinking of it as the amazing, inevitable destination that started all those years ago when I first left home. So that's what these stories mean to me. I hope you will think about these stories and think about what they mean to you, or find other women. There are so many amazing women in history who can inspire us to fight for ourselves and to find our own space, and to know that we are part of a long line of truly badass women. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the night, and if you have any questions about who we talked about or anyone else, feel free to come and talk with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.